Hey, hello everyone. I'm John Humphreys, Executive Director for the Association for Equity and Funding, a group that's been advocating around revenue limits and other aspects of school funding for over 30 years now. Joined here by Sara from the Wisconsin Policy Forum and Dr. Charles Franklin from Marquette University to talk about Sara's new report relating to K-12 referenda and revenue limit gaps. And Sara, the first thing I'd like to kick us off with, it's the kind of the conclusion of your introductory section. We find a system that may no longer be fulfilling some policy goals as frequent use of referenda contribute to growing disparities. Yeah, we definitely would agree with that. What, in your mind, are the policy goals that we're starting to maybe detract from or stray from?
So I will not disclose what age I was in 1993, but my understanding of the 93 kind of grand bargain around school funding was, and this is going to be very reductionist, but essentially, let's put in place revenue limits to make sure that taxpayers have some protection and districts are getting funding they need, but at a predictable rate. And we'll couple it with inflation so that revenue limit increases are aligning with cost increases. And there will be a certain amount of funding that the state is always putting toward education. And if the district does not feel like that is an appropriate amount of funding, then there's this option that allows for local control to go to referendum and say, all right, local communities, yes, we support our district in going above and beyond that revenue limit set by the state. We will approve this and go forth and conquer. And so when we think about whether kind of the intentions such as they might have been in that original grand bargain, if they have met with where we policymakers may have hoped that it would go, we do see this increased use of referendums. That's all well and good. You could make an argument that that's the system working exactly as it should. But what this analysis was finding is the use of those referenda now appear to be fulfilling a fear that many in the public school world had, which is that the increased use of referenda would increase the disparities between districts that have and districts that do not have, and specifically districts that are willing to pass referenda and continue increasing their revenue limit, and those that are not and are kind of stuck back where they had been in 93 with, of course, the additional per pupil adjustments made by the state legislature and governor along the way. So that's really what we're honing in on, is the role of referenda in widening those gaps. And where does that leave us in terms of the funding system, perhaps leading in a direction that policymakers may not have fully intended?
Yeah, thank you. And I would even sort of bookend that in two ways. One is the state constitution, 1848. The legislature shall provide for district schools as nearly uniform as practicable, which probably is different 150 years ago than it is now. But certainly from a funding perspective, there's a lot of variation. And then, of course, the Vincent Voigt decision, which AEF was part of the Vincent Voigt Supreme Court case. And one of their conclusions was students should have an equal opportunity for a sound basic education. And this really starts to strike at that. So it's interesting then, Charles Franklin, we see voters approve most referenda amid waning support. Maybe talk about that waning support. Isn't that interesting in the sort of disconnect between the approval rates and Judge Chris Taylor's election?
Now, there is a declining success rate for referenda. I know the policy forum, Sara, have been looking at this, and I've stolen their charts from time to time to show it. And correct me if I say anything wrong about the policy forum's findings, but it looks like referenda passage rates peaked around 2018 or so, and have been working their way downward steadily since then. We still pass a majority of referenda. I think it was a little over 60% this spring, but that's down from the passage rate earlier. That parallels the findings in the Marquette Law School polls, where we see that asked whether it's more important to hold down property taxes or more important to increase funding for public schools, funding for public schools rose from about 2013, when we first started asking the question, it peaked at around 60% or a little more in about 2018, and has been declining since. Since about 2021 or early 22, we've seen more people saying that holding down property taxes is more important than increasing funding for schools. And that has only grown over time. Compared to the referenda passage rate, and the rate of passage has been coming down virtually in parallel with lower support for schools in our question. There's a gap between them and still far more passed than people say that school funding is more important. But there is an important relationship between those two, showing that declining subjective support for school spending in our survey does have a lot to say about decreasing passage rates for referenda as well.
Yeah,
Also,
and
we've
then
asked
go
we've
ahead,
asked
please.
if there is a referenda, would you vote for it or against it? We saw majorities saying they would vote for it before 2025, but starting in late 2025 for the first time, we saw more people saying they would vote against a referenda rather than for it.
Interesting. Would you also reflect then for a moment on the election of Judge Taylor? Interesting disconnect there. She won handily, and yet our referendum rates are not. Has there been any look at where she won and any of those kinds of things? That's probably cross-tab analysis or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two things going on there. One is a statewide election for a state office is very different from local referenda that are particular to individual school districts. And one of the most important things you don't see in the referenda are in those districts that don't propose a referendum, in part because they don't believe it can pass. And so there's a real censorship of the data, if you will. What we see with referenda is that they only occur in districts where there's at least some belief that there's a chance of passing them. And we never see those districts that don't even propose one. So I don't think the direct comparison works very well in that sense, because if you look geographically, even in the more Republican areas of the state, those areas that propose a referendum may be different from those that don't. I think the other side of the Supreme Court race is simply that we've seen the liberal candidates doing well in Supreme Court races for the last several races. Taylor's win was especially large. Um, but I don't think it's a direct connection between that and other public policy issues like school funding.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Sarah, I'd like to put the chart here on screen and ask you if you would just walk us through this a little bit, if you could. Hopefully that's showing for you guys. Do you see that?
Yeah. So we publish this chart about once a year, um, alternating between whether we're focusing on the even numbered years or the odd number years. You see that up and down of the passage rate and of the number of referenda on ballots really shifting depending on that even or odd year, with the even numbered years aligning with when there is a midterm or a presidential election. So in off years, which is to say odd number years, we typically have both lower numbers of referenda going on ballots and lower passage rates of those referenda. Now, the big caveat on this chart is that 2026 has that asterisk because it's only showing spring elections. That is that April 7th election. So all of our conclusions here are preliminary based on pending what happens this fall. But generally what we're seeing, you can see that 2018 peak that Dr. Franklin spoke to, where the passage rate hit 90%. And then again, trying to track kind of those every other year nodes, we really see a weakened support. I think TBD whether the passage rates continue declining or stagnate, but whichever way we go, we're certainly not jumping back up to 90% anytime soon. So it really is a different landscape for districts now than it was back in 2018, and indeed getting closer to where we were back in the 2010s.
Yeah, and
The
if
other
oh, I'm sorry, please.
Well, the other thing I want to point out about this chart is if you look at the green bars, no, our dark bars. So the dark blue and the dark green, these are our operating referenda as opposed to the capital referenda, which are the light blue and the light green. And it's a little hard to tell just in the setup of the chart, but the proportion of referenda that were on the spring ballots for 2026 was heavily weighted toward these operating referenda. There were 84% of referenda on ballots were operating referenda. And that's the highest that is on this chart. Typically, we were seeing operating referenda making up no more than 60% of referenda on ballots, and even that was considered high. So the fact that we jumped up to 84% in this last election, again, pending what we see in the fall, but it really seems like something of a sea change around what districts are asking for from their voters and their hope for use of referenda to really fund operating costs as opposed to capital construction or renovation costs.
Yeah, thank you. I heard my printer going off. I didn't print anything. That's weird. So thank you. Yeah, that was going to be the question I wanted to ask about was the sort of the blue lines and the high level of blue lines. And you talk about this in the report, over $500 million of new funds for school districts, including 208 million for capital projects, 330 million for operations. And so, yeah, substantial amounts of new dollars going to school districts. One of the things I wanted to point out for our listeners and viewers is that those referenda are not entirely paid just by local taxpayers. I think what people don't understand is that there's a pool of what's called general aid or equalization aid. And as districts pass those referenda, it's considered additional spending, and that spending gets aided through the revenue limit system and the equalization aid formula. And so when school districts pass these massive and even not so massive referenda, but $500 million here, those funds eventually start to be pulled from the pool of equalization aid. This year, compared to last year, we have 70% of school districts getting less aid this year. And Milwaukee, in fact, got over $100 million in new aid this year compared to last year. And it's partly because of their referendum spending. So
That's right.
it gets back to those policy goals like you're talking about.
It does. And I think that's also an important voter education piece here, to be able to understand the breakdown of, for example, in Milwaukee, that first year of the referenda did fall on property taxpayers. And it's been subsequent years where the referendum is funded more by state aids as opposed to property tax dollars increasing. And the way that that's going to play out from district to district will vary quite a bit just based on where a district falls in the equalization aid formula.
Yeah. Sarah, I just want to scroll down here in the report now, this next piece where you talk about the gaps between higher and lower funded districts. But before we go there, Charles Franklin, have you done work to look at sort of differential endorsement and support vis-a-vis the demographics of the school districts or areas where people are endorsing their support for tax reductions or school funding?
I think the main thing that we see is that there's not a whole lot of very strong demographic predictors on this.
Interesting.
Older folks are more reluctant to vote for referenda. I don't think that's particularly surprising. It's certainly a finding that not only do we find, but most studies of votes on school funding or property taxes, the older folks who don't have school-age children and may be on limited incomes are much more reluctant to support. That shows up. We do see that satisfaction with the schools has held fairly steady over time. There's been some increase in the percent that are dissatisfied, less of an increase with the very dissatisfied. It won't surprise you that the folks who are dissatisfied are less supportive of school funding and less willing to vote for increases. But that is not what's driving the change in the relative balance between property taxes versus school funding, because the change in satisfaction is pretty modest. It's gone from high water marks that were up in the 70%, 75% range 10 plus years ago, down to about 60% satisfied now. So there's some change there, but it's not dramatic. The other thing, though, that we do see is Republicans have become a lot more skeptical of funding schools rather than Democrats or independents. And so there is more of a partisan gap on this question of support for school funding and also on satisfaction with public schools, with Republicans generally positive towards the schools, but a lot less positive than they were, again, a decade or more ago.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a conversation with a taxpayer just last week. A gentleman who was retired. He said, I don't have any kids. And tell me why my tax bill went up so much and why should I be invested in this? It was a great conversation. He was particularly interested in special education funding, which kind of strikes to the heart in a sense of inadequate funding for special education pulling from general education to cover unfunded costs, hence the need for referenda, or at least one part of that need. So, Sarah Shaw, walk us through this gap between higher and lower funded school districts. Andy Rashevsky talks about the coefficient of variation, which gets into statistics. I like this one. It shows the folks at the top and the bottom. Why don't you tell us about this one?
Yeah. So one clarification on this graph that I think sometimes gets misinterpreted is when we're talking about 10th and 90th percentile, slightly different from talking about the top 10% and the bottom 10%. And it's also not talking about the income threshold for students. This is strictly about revenue limits that districts receive as set by the state. And if our 10th percentile of districts are going to be those for whom their revenue limit value is below, let's see, I have to make sure I get it right. It's above just 10% of districts versus those in the 90th percentile, their revenue limit is above 90% of districts. Another important point in this graph is thinking about, well, do we actually want revenue limits to be exactly equal? And I think you could make a strong argument that actually you shouldn't, that we should have differences in funding for school districts based on student need or cost of living differences, other kind of justifiable variations. In that context, what's striking to me about this graph is that, let's say we said, okay, we do want some variation between districts. We probably don't want that variation to be yawning wider and wider. We might want it to be consistent or smaller, maybe a little bit bigger, but bigger over time indicates something happening that's really widening a gap. And that's what we see here. So in 2005, the gap between those 10th percentile districts and the 90th percentile districts was 25%, which is decently material to start with. And then by the time you get to 2025, that gap has yawned wide enough to get to 38%. That's a very material difference for districts in these two positions that we take just a couple of examples to help illustrate. It doesn't appear to be tied to differences in student need between these types of different districts or differences in the student population or the geography. It really appears that referenda are a driving factor here, which again goes back to that point that where we allow for local control, that is real autonomy for the communities at hand, but it also positions those communities that cannot pass a referendum or don't believe that they can pass a referenda to potentially get left behind here.
Yeah, let's step back for a minute so that folks understand it. And when I explain the revenue limit system to people, they say, wait, what? They don't quite understand it. It's whatever the school district was spending in 1993 became their revenue limit. And if you extend that chart farther to the left, you'd see significant differences at that time. The low spending was Waterford, the high spending was Nicolet, both suburban Milwaukee area school districts. Waterford was about 5,500, and if memory serves, Nicolet was at 7,500. So you had a 50% additional funding in Nicolet compared to Waterford. And I'm fond of saying those differences get baked in and you can't get them out. And you can bring the bottom up and you can address this through referenda. But again, what you're showing here is that we're not solving this problem through referendums. It's continuing. And in fact, the gaps are getting really more substantial.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that low revenue piece because one lever that has been available to policymakers and legislators specifically has been the low revenue ceiling, which may be one of the more terribly named policy levers I've ever heard. But essentially, what's that floor of what a district's revenue limit can be. And it's been available to policymakers and legislators, and they've used it in some budgets to raise up that floor so that districts that have the lowest revenue limit, and I know AEF has been active around this issue, that they get increases to try to lessen the gap. And that was one of the surprises to me in looking at this graph, is that to whatever extent that has ameliorated the issue, it has not solved it. This gap has continued to widen, not lessen.
Yeah. A couple of interesting pieces of the puzzle with regard to the revenue limits. We've done a fair amount of studies. We've seen significant difference in class sizes, differences with regard to specialist staff like nurses, counselors, reading specialists, librarians. We've seen differences in open enrollment rates. So low revenue school districts losing kids to open enrollment to better, higher funded school districts. We see higher college entrance rates. So there's myriad ways that the student experience, to say nothing of the district's budget, are affected by these revenue limits. I was at a restaurant in far northern Wisconsin, and our waitress was this young lady, looked like high school age. It was May. She was wearing her, this was a few years ago, wearing her high school sweatshirt. And we said, what are your plans after high school? And she said, well, at my school, I have a really neat program in our K-8 school. And we do adventure camping and wilderness canoeing, and we have a ropes course, and we do all these great activities, and it's all free. It's all part of our school program. Well, lo and behold, their school program is funded by a revenue limit over $20,000, or just about $20,000 per student, which is substantially higher than what you're seeing here, the $10,000 to $12,000 per student. And it was interesting because she started to talk about these career opportunities. For some reason, my standing desk is sitting down. So she started to talk about these career opportunities that were made possible by these additional funding levels. So it was pretty neat. Also, kind of disconcerting for those of us in the rest of the state who don't have revenue limits $20,000 and more. Well, let's see, as we're going to start to wrap up here, I don't want to lose track of a couple things. Sara, your report talks about the increasing number of referenda due to a combination of factors. Revenue limit increases have not kept pace with inflation, tight labor markets, high inflation, and the expiration of federal pandemic aid, declining student enrollment. It looks like this is just kind of an ongoing source of keeping districts afloat. And when they fail, what we're starting to see now is districts like Hustisford who are having to consider closing or consolidation. I think we're going to start to see that more and more.
Now, the range of outcomes for districts here, I think, is pretty broad. Decline in student enrollment is affecting the majority of districts in the state. But what that means in terms of how urgent and dramatic the need is, I think varies quite a bit. Hustisford is a great example of really kind of an existential threat to their existence. And there are other districts in similar straits. On the flip side, I think you have districts that may have gone to referendum and had it fail, or gone to referendum and had it passed, but are not sure that they would be able to pass another one in the future. And for those districts, this might be kind of that moment to say, we can't kick the can down the road anymore. We're like, we really need to think about what it looks like to still try to provide quality education for our children in this epoch of declining student enrollment, because there is no indication that enrollment is about to bounce back. There might be some efforts by individual school districts to attract more kids there from other districts, but as a state, declining in student enrollment is where we're at. So I think that range of experiences is part of what makes this a tough issue to talk to policymakers about or to talk to voters about, because every district is incentivized to say that, hey, this is really bad for us. And I'm not here to say that it's not bad. But I do think there is a difference in kind between, or it's better said, a difference in degree between districts that are facing the hard reality of fiscal constraints that we would prefer not to have to deal with because it is hard. versus districts that really are kind of staring down the barrel of a gun. And I think it's up to individual district leaders in their communities to kind of gauge which side of the spectrum they're on, and therefore what actions need to be taken next.
Well, so as we start to wrap up here, Charles Franklin, I'm just, you've been doing this for more than a few years and really have seen so many longitudinal trends. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of perspective. Have you seen these surveys sort of come and the endorsement levels come and go, the support levels come and go? What sort of big themes stand out for you?
Yeah, I think the number one theme is that when we first started polling on this in 2012 and 2013, um, people were concerned about property taxes. It was about the uneven split between property taxes and school funding. But then, as we went through some reductions or proposed reductions in state aid to schools or state financing for schools, we saw the surge in support for schools up into that 70% plus range, peaking about 2018, only to then see it begin to gradually but steadily decline ever since. So it's really been this nice rising and then falling pretty steadily over time without lots of short term jigs and jags, but really a sort of smooth increase and now a smooth decrease. I think there are two other things I'd like to get on the table, and that is number one, how schools are funded is complicated and hard to explain to voters. Many voters think it's entirely funded through the property tax or that property taxes only go to schools. But also, there's a lot of lack of understanding about what role state aid plays in that as well. And so I think one of the complications is that, at least to my ear, the political rhetoric we've heard mostly about school funding is one side saying we need to fully fund schools without saying where that money comes from or what funding would have to be cut in order to move funding to schools if we're talking about state funding. Another saying it's all about reducing property taxes without acknowledging that there are other ways to pay for schools other than just property taxes. We asked a question in February about whether the legislature has failed to provide enough funding for schools. 51% said that, but 49% said schools needed to learn to live within their budgets and not ask for more property taxes. And so I think that even divide on this question is partly a reflection of not knowing too much about where this money comes from and what the options are for funding. The other thing is, Sara mentioned declining school enrollments, which we've asked about several times. And the main thing we find there is something close to 40% say they don't know whether their school district is losing enrollment or not. They also don't know how their test scores are going in their school districts. And that's no better for parents than it is for non-parents. And so I think, again, this question of information that voters get about how schools are funded, what the options are for funding them, is complicated in part because candidates for office don't find it useful for them to talk about these complicated details of how funding works and what the trade-offs might be. But it's also a matter of, even if your kid is going to the K-12 program in your school district, you still aren't that tuned in to the specifics of how that district's performing, what its outlook for student enrollment may be, and what its funding needs are.
Yeah, interesting. And do you do this same kind of survey across states? Do you follow this kind of trend? Where does Wisconsin stand?
We do not do multi-state funding or polling on it. We have asked the satisfaction with schools in our national surveys. As you would expect, satisfaction in the national data varies a lot more from state to state. Obviously, here we're looking in a single state. Whereas I said, there's been about a 10-point shift maybe in the satisfaction with schools over the last 15 years. which is not trivial, but it's not gigantic.
Sure. Yeah.
And it does vary by region of the state, with satisfaction lowest in the Milwaukee area, but actually satisfaction quite high in much of the rural parts of the state, which are also those very parts of the state that are facing some of the enrollment declines.
And closures.
And closures and
Consolidation.
consolidation. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, interesting. Sarah Shaw, closing comments, thoughts as we reach the end of our time here.
Well, the first I'll say is Charles mentioned using our work in his work. That is mutual stealing that occurs. We've cited the Marquette Law School poll multiple times, and I think it really does kind of give this bellwether on not just what's happening, but why it's happening, which is so valuable for understanding the policy shifts at work here, and particularly for districts or communities, hoping to better understand what their communities are open to. I think my last point has to do with just where the potential call to action is here. I mentioned where districts really need to be looking at their enrollment patterns and their expenditures in comparison to revenue. I do think there's a role for the state here as well. Wisconsin is not alone in being a declining enrollment state. The issues here are affecting much of the nation as well. And it would be wonderful to see some models of, well, what does it look like for the state to support this? We have a whole model built on growth, and growth is not where we are at right now, at least at the moment. So I'm really hoping to see examples of creativity and transparency and data-driven decision-making and communication happening not only between districts and their communities, but also between the state and districts.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And you guys use each other's works. I use yours, so I really appreciate all of the work that you both do, and it helps us tell an important story about how trends, finance, public perception is affecting our schools and our ability to advocate and support kids in the end. So really appreciate all of your work. Thank you. I'm going to end the recording here and do that.